Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you were with us for Sunday Forum at St. Luke's Church downtown Atlanta. I am thrilled to be having the conversation with my two wonderful friends and I think colleagues as we have a conversation about a very important moment in our collective life together as a culture, as a nation, and as people. Let me kind of set up what we're going to do, and then I'm going to introduce our guests. So it is by design that we're having this particular forum conversation on both All Saints Sunday, which happens to be the eve of our presidential election, just 2 days away. And as a pastor and as a human being, I am so very aware that we are living in a time of crisis and a time of chaos. And I think that before we get into November, where we are digesting what has happened to us in the election, that we simply mark this moment and talk about the importance of having spiritual and mental and relational health in a time of the election. And it was just really clear to me that I should invite Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown and Dr. Lisa Boswell to be our kind of experts today. Dr. Coleman Brown is a psychology professor emerita at Agnes Scott. She has distinguished herself in many ways. We have had her as a guest at St. Luke's before when we were doing a series of conversations about this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful sound of the genuine, marvelous person, Dr. Howard Thurman. And she's an expert there. She also is an expert on the heart. She herself has had a heart transplant. And she has an amazing book that I commend to you, When the Heart Speaks, Listen, Discerning Inner Wisdom. And no doubt she's going to rely on all of that when we're in our conversation. Dr. Lisa Boswell is a practicing psychiatrist, a member of St. Luke's Episcopal Church. She is a theologian. She has been a teacher of our Education for Ministry class for quite a while. She lives and thinks and feels a balance of theology and science and psychiatry and psychotherapy. She also serves on our search committee for the new rector. So we've got two people who are very, very resourceful, and I simply want to welcome both of you. Thank you very much, Dr. Coleman Brown. Thank you very much, Dr. Boswell, for being with us.
Thank you.
So we're going to ask each of them to kind of begin by talking about how they respond to this question of how do we promote spiritual, relational, and mental health in this time where there's so much sensationalism and polarization in the media, in politics, but also as we are all negotiating being vulnerable as individuals and as a people to this pandemic of coronavirus, and also how there is this awakening to systemic racism in our culture and how we're dealing with that also. So I want to start with you, Dr. Coleman Brown. Would you just kind of initially address what you're thinking, what you're advocating, and what you're feeling as you both give advice in spiritual direction and retreat direction, but also in your own conversations with yourself about mental health and spiritual health?
Well, this certainly is a time of multiple pandemics, if we'd like to call them that. I think certainly in my lifetime, I've never seen anything like it, when you have a number of crises happening at the same time. And for me, I think it's been an important time, particularly in terms of turning inward, because there's so much chaos and confusion outward, that I've been paying a little bit more attention to my inner life and to the kinds of things that I allow to affect that in the many ways that it could. And I've been very intentional about my spiritual life, very intentional about engaging with it, probably more so than normal. So, utilizing my spiritual practices of having quiet time in the morning and the evenings, going outside and communing with nature and being able to get some fresh air and perhaps some exercise, reading inspirational material, and restricting the kind of communication that is coming in to me and to my spirit. I have found it very useful, of course, to be a mentor, a spiritual mentor to other people who come to me and call. These are not just the people that I see in spiritual direction, but friends and family. I was talking to someone today that was just overwhelmed. And so I just took a little time to speak with her about, how she might be able to, find some joy in the present moment, perhaps maybe, taking some time back away from all the things that are going on. And so part of my intentionality was to create a silent retreat at home, since I can't go to a retreat center at this point. And so at the end of August, my husband and I took about 3 days off the grid in our house. And it was probably one of the most fabulous things that I have done to counteract all the negativity, all the attacks, all of the upheaval. And of course, coming back from that, I found that I really needed to restrict the amount of television, particularly in terms of news that I was watching. So I think this is the very time to pay attention to, your spiritual life. And I sort of used this technique when I was going through the transplant, several years ago, which is, when there is a crisis, all the more reason to, do things that are going to feed your spirit and bring some joy, make your heart sing, do something, activity that might make your heart sing.
Thank you. What a meaty beginning. I've taken a lot of notes and we're going to return to a lot of those topics. Dr. Boswell, how are you thinking about relational, mental, and spiritual health these days?
Thank you, Ed, and thank you so much for including me in this wonderful meeting today. I really share a lot of what Dr. Coleman Brown was talking about in terms of, I've laughingly called this time kind of revenge of the introverts, because my soul actually sort of grows with a slower pace, with more quiet, with more demands. And so I think it's okay to name that. And it's interesting, since I sit in the clinical world, and about half of the population are introverts, about half of people in many ways are doing better. Now, not in every way, and this is a very broad situation, but I think it's important to say where we're doing better and where we're not. And also, I have moved into very intentional silent practices. I was able to do a retreat on Thomas Merton back in May, a silent retreat also, that was so wonderful, with a group in Iowa, of all places, a retreat center there. And I wouldn't have gotten to do that, in regular times. I pay very much close attention to self-care, exercise, my time in nature, and really listening for what is restorative and claiming that and being honest about that. So if I don't do that well, then I can't help anyone else do that well. And I have to speak to the Education for Ministry community that I'm a part of. I've been a mentor. And I can't claim to be a true theologian, but I'm a lay theologian. And but those practices, and isn't it true that our practices are what really keep us grounded and well in a time like this, are just profoundly important to me and keep me well and keep us anchored for the waves that we're riding right now. So
thanks. before I leave you, Dr. Boswell, I know that resilience is an issue and also trauma. And this applies to both of you actually, how we all somatize what's going on. And there is this connection between spirit, mind, body. It's really an artifice to divide all that up. And everything kind of shows up in the body. So Lisa, would you talk a little bit about resiliency and trauma in the body? And you've been doing some teaching about that at St. Luke's.
Yeah, I have been. And I've been sharing some of the work I was able to do again over the summer because everything's on Zoom. So I've spent some time in some continuing medical education work with the Harvard Mind Body Institute, which is just doing amazing work. They are synthesizing a lot of what we know that is accessible for all people. And I think it's one of the most important things I've done. And one of the things they teach in this class is really the research around stress, the body, and particularly the immune system, that it has such relevance now for the pandemic that we're in. It's one of the things researchers are looking at in terms of who gets really sick, what sort of stress burden they bring to the illness from the beginning. We have known for a long time the effects of stress on metabolic pathways, but stress on the immune system is fairly recent information, and literally, people with higher stress burdens coming in have sometimes decreased T cell function, which is actually part of the immune response to COVID-19. So it brings up the most amazing science, theology, social, race, trauma questions that I've ever seen. And I think we will be able to integrate this and synthesize it in new ways. I really believe that. So, so that's just a little bit on what we know about the effects of trauma and stress. The resiliency part is the part we can do to influence our health, what we choose to do, the habits, the practices. And one of the ways we think about that is it's how we receive our stress load with that. And that becomes one of the 3 pillars of medicine. And this is, I'm borrowing from the Harvard Mind Body Institute, but a 3-legged stool of traditional medicine, pharmaceuticals, surgery is another leg of the stool, but self-care is the 3rd leg. And so they've really given us some new language on how to put all this together. And I find it a really great way of integrating our life as a church, the value of community, social networks, and all that, as opposed to sometimes through history, we've had an either or approach to spirituality or church or health that we all know has been not good for people, but this is a way to integrate it all. So we've had a great time in our class, and we're continuing. So.
That's really powerful. I want to ask Dr. Coleman Brown to come in here because she has a significant chapter in her life that is ongoing that brings in medicine as well. Literally living with a different heart organ. And you learned so much from that you've already shared a little bit with us at St. Luke's and with me, and certainly in your book. But I'd love for you to kind of come in now with this, Lerita. What do you bring into this conversation about mind, body, spirit, stress, etc., from your own experience?
Well, I think that there are 2 things. One is that, I've had 2 transplants. So 10 years after the heart transplant, I had a kidney transplant.
Oh my.
And as part of that, I went through some organ rejection. So in one episode, I was in the hospital for 27 days at University of Alabama, Birmingham. And it was really the first time I thought I was going to die. because it had been one of those long years of many deaths in the family and among friends. But again, I think the spiritual practices that I began to engage in the 80s came back to aid me in navigating not only the uncertainty, because you don't know from day to day what might happen, because you're in a whole new world, right? You're walking this journey, and nobody else around you is walking it with you. Although there, of course, there are support groups, etc. But it's like unknown territory, and I think that's when, for me, having a connection to like a spirit inside or inner knowingness really helped me to navigate that. And of course, having a community of people, not only family, but others in my faith, community, to be praying for me, and I knowing that was really important. So, you have, as Lisa alluded to, these different aspects. You do have the medicine, and you do have your family support and your support from your faith community, but you also have that sort of grounded or rooted connection to something other than yourself, to something bigger than yourself. And I'm very grateful that, I sort of have had a buddy relationship with the Holy Spirit, since a little girl. So, I mean, helping me get through graduate school and helping me, and let's not talk about the fact that these things were happening while I was teaching as a professor, right? So totally, and single for most of it. The second transplant, I had gotten married by that time. And sometimes I look back and think, I don't know how I got through that. I do think that, there are certain elements of post-traumatic growth that also helped me, through this, which is that I made a decision, when I made the decision to have the transplant, heart transplant, which was almost like an invitation in some ways, because I was having these mystical experiences, kind of like, yes, we want you to have this transplant. And you'll understand it better, long after this, that once I made that decision, I believed that everything that I needed was going to come with me, and it did. So it required what Marcus Borg talks about is radical trust in God, because you don't have anything else. You just don't have anything else.
Lerita, please tell the story now about my inviting you into this conversation and how you responded. It really surprised me, and it made so much profound sense in the same moment. So please tell that story, because it relates to what you just talked about, it seems to be, and would be so helpful for everybody to have as we are negotiating this time of stress.
Yeah, so Ed calls me the other day and says, he sends an email and says, hey, can we talk? And I'm thinking, okay, what's going on? And so we have a chance to talk, and he's such a charismatic person. So he's having the nice conversation, and then he says, okay, I know, what's the ask? And so he tells me what he'd like to do, have this forum, et cetera. And so I said, well, how much time do I have to make a decision? He said, well, you can call me tomorrow. I said, well, thank you, because I need to, I need to pray about this. I need to consult the Spirit about this, about whether or not this is something I should be doing. We get lots of requests all the time, or lots of things to be involved in. And I have found it really important, particularly during these times, to have a consultation and to go inside and say, are you calling me to this, or is this just another thing that's out there that I could be doing? Because particularly for people like us who have lots of possibilities, when you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else. And I'm really paying attention to that, particularly in these times, because I sort of feel both for self-care. I am very clear that I have had all these medical issues, and we're not even talking about all of it, right? We're just talking about the two major things. We won't talk about the bowel replacement and the pacemaker and all that other stuff, right?
Wow.
But so I'm also aware that, I can't run myself ragged. So I'm getting better at pausing and asking, am I really being called to this, or is this an ego trip, or, what is this? And so you gave me an opportunity to, really take it into prayer and to listen, to Spirit about whether or not this is something that I needed to be involved in today. So.
Now, everybody who's watching, I just want to note that we are talking about something that's both very profoundly spiritual and practically healthy. And Lerita, I remember you're saying, as you were saying, I need to not answer you right now, Ed. You had just talked with your spiritual director, as I remember, yes. And your spiritual director had said, ask whether a choice you have before you is your job or is your calling.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's correct. I mean, it was such a gift to me, because as a person who's out there engaged in spiritual work, I get lots of calls, and, people are always saying, oh, we'd love you to come talk about this, or, we'll offer you an honorarium. And I've come to understand it's not about the honorarium. It's really about, is this my work? Is this what I'm being called to do? Or is this just a job, another job to do? And as a person who has flunked retirement like you, Ed, I value my time in a different sort of way. I mean, I don't have to work. And so all the work that I'm, pretty much doing is because I feel called to do it. I feel like I need to make a contribution to, the restoration of God's beloved creation. And so this is my part. This is the part I can do, because, given some of my physical limitations, this is the part that I can do. And so, yes, it was such a gift for her to say, I think you need to pay attention to whether or not this is just another activity, or if this is something that you're truly being called to do, because this is part of the work that you are here to do.
Lisa, how is this resonating in with your thinking and your own your practice as a psychiatrist, but your own living as a human being trying to be healthy?
Well, I think Lerita just described what we talk about in our EFM group about discernment. That's such an important practice in Christian history, that there can be many, many good things we can do, good choices out there, but discernment is what is mine to do, what is mine to do at this time. And putting that together, that is part of the spiritual journey and part of living as a mature Christian in the world. And I just so appreciate just that example of how to do that, because we all have to do more of that. And I think, Ed, you've mentioned a time or two, getting overabundance of Zoom, because now we have the whole world in front of us and there's so much. And now I'm finding, I need to pull back on some of that. Just because I can doesn't mean that I should do another thing of these great offerings. So that's part of discernment and part of our journey into God.
And it is part of our responsibility about our diet, our mental and emotional diet, what we allow to come in. Like you were saying, Lerita, earlier about you and your husband just unplugging. And I find myself, there's so many wonderful Zoom opportunities for education these days. And I want to do it all, I just want to keep going back, to the self-serve table and helping my plate. And there were days where I had to stop and say, no, your brain doesn't want anything else today. And then also, I'll never forget the day I was almost weeping at the news, because it was breaking my heart. So many people being killed, so many people being separated from their parents and put in cages, so much cruelty. And I had to stop and say, I need to pray my way through the news. And I started lighting the candle. And I light a candle every night when I watch Judy Woodruff, just to pray my way through the news. But before gosh, I could talk with you two forever.
Can I just say something, Ed, though?
Please interrupt anytime.
Because, I've noticed that in all the sort of places like the Missionaries of the Poor or other places that are taking people in and have that really serious work to do, with the kinds of things that you're talking about, they do pray regularly. And they say the only way to get through this kind of work is to pray, almost on schedule, not just in the morning, in the evening, but throughout the day. It's what gets them through. And when you think about, sort of Jesus, he was praying, as much as he could. I mean, as he was, moving about. And I also think about that treasure, a Testament devotion written by Thomas Kelly, the Quaker mystic. And, his last chapter in that book is really about, we have a multitude of things coming at us all the time. And that it's so important to pause and go into that divine center, as he described it, because it will tell you what it is that you should do and what it is you need to just say, well, grieve the loss of that opportunity, but you can't do everything.
I really do want to underscore how important it is to touch base with, to access, and to listen to, and to ask our divine center or our inner sanctuary or the sound of the genuine, whatever your metaphor, God, the Holy Spirit, whatever your metaphor is, it's all metaphorical, for this holy who abides inside us and is quietly, patiently waiting to be consulted, about it all. Now, I want to go back to the American Psychological Association paper or findings. I was instructed by their saying that the stressors and the mental health quotient are different for different groups of people in our society. And they sing, I'm thinking right now, they talked about elders having very different stressors than parents of young children. I want to ask you two, if you don't mind, to talk a little bit about the parents of young children right now who seem to be doing their own businesses, doing their own homeschooling, and there seem not to be a lot of choices. They wake up in the morning and bam, here it goes. Can you all address any kind of advice or solace or light that you would offer to that group of our brothers and sisters?
Well, we've said this and we all say it every day. I mean, these are just absolutely historic times, and the stressors on families with young children, I think, are the most significant. It's a time, I love the phrase post-traumatic growth, because I think there is also a lot of growth happening in the world that's very positive and good, and then there's great strain. The growth is that people are reconnecting with families in some ways, realizing you cannot do this by yourself. You cannot work. We can only do one thing at a time. We can think we're multitasking, but we really can only do one thing at a time. So you can work, you can teach your children, you can homeschool, you can raise children, but you really cannot do all of that together. And so being honest about that, and there is something about the leveling of this that's probably going to be really good for us as a society. But I have seen a lot of young families reach out to their parents and grandparents and extended families and friends to come in new and creative ways. It's very, very important. And I think, again, just recognizing we can't do it all. and building on the things we can do to control our health and our strength and resiliency. And that's certainly what we're doing. And I'm encouraged that there's a recognition of this, I think, out in the world today. That feels very encouraging for me. So
Thanks. Lerita, how does this resonate in you?
I would certainly agree with everything that Lisa said. I think we are seeing a bit more interconnectivity within families, trying to support each other as much as they can. And it is true that we can't do it all. And I'm a bit concerned about, though, the number of women who are having to leave the workforce because much of the brunt of taking care of young children goes to the mother. And so I'm not sure what impact this will have long term, but I would hope that we can continue to encourage those women to have hope that after much of this passes, they will be able to return to the kinds of careers that they were engaged in before, but perhaps maybe at a different level. Because I think there is that pulling in all these different directions, which is obviously not good for the health, the mental health or physical health of the young mothers. So yes, it's a really stressful time. People have been saying we don't pay teachers enough, and I think a lot of parents have discovered that in trying to do homeschooling under conditions that are not really, well suited for that.
Yeah. I'm going to speak as an elder now. For those of us who are in our elderhood, I want to say that, and then invite your response, how important it is for us to be careful about our diet of relationships and our conversations that we have. We've talked about a diet about technology. We've talked about a diet of, we haven't mentioned social media, but that's clearly a place where we need to restrict our intake. And also the news as well. But now I want to talk about the kinds of conversations you have. I have begun to practice a new level of self-focus, to pay attention to how I feel after certain conversations. And there are certain conversations that are draining or that call for a lot of work. And then there are other conversations, and they may be work-oriented also. But gosh, it feels like my soul has been nurtured afterwards. And don't I have a responsibility to myself to pay attention to that and make sure that I'm engaging in the kind that is gonna give me soul food? Can you all respond to that?
It's funny you talk about that, Ed. One of the little exercises in our resiliency class is an energy battery. And so we have the drains and the charges. And so, of course, we all have sometimes relationships that are part of our lives that we can't choose not to have, but to be honest about how much of a drain is that causing, and then maybe how to think about that later in the day. That becomes the work of self-care that's actually really important. And again, paying attention and honoring your response to things and the reality of energy drains of all sorts on our lives. So I love that.
Lerita?
Yes, I would agree. I think that oftentimes we don't pay attention, and so somehow or other we notice that we're drained, that it's very difficult because you've been talking to someone who spends the entire time complaining or talking about something that you probably talked about 10 times before, but nothing is happening. And I actually had a conversation somewhat like that with a friend, and I had given her some resources, and so I said to her, I said, "Well, have you followed up on the resources?" And she said, "Well, no." And I said, "Well, we used to have a little thing at Agnes Scott. It's like, if you're doing more work than the student, then that's a red flag, right? So if you're doing more work than the person you're trying to help, then that's a red flag. So I think it's really important to be aware of those people who bring you energy, and who are life-giving in the kind of conversations that they share with you, versus those who are not. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm going to talk to that person
Sure.
who needs to talk,
Right.
right? But it may not be frequently.
Yes.
And I think I have, it is my responsibility, particularly as a person who is a spiritual director, and that's part of what I do, that it's important for me to make sure that I'm limiting those things that are going to drain me, or to find some other way to be restored, so that when I need that for someone else, it's present.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes we engage in something that I grew up with, which was to be nice.
Yes.
Which means to be pleasing,
Yes.
as opposed to being helpful, in a way that empowers the person to be able to take care of themselves, as opposed to coming to you all the time for help.
Before we kind of wrap up by talking about this historic moment that we're in politically, and I'm not going to ask you to reveal your politics, but just kind of all of this. Before we go there, I want to come back to something that each of you mentioned, having to do with nature. So I find it a diminishment in my day if I haven't had a really good walk. That's body stuff, right? But also for me, to walk for me amongst trees. I am particularly open to communication with trees. And I'm one of the people who, along with many, many others, I know both of you are fans of Richard Rohr, about the universal Christ being in absolutely every participant part of creation. And there is a divine luminosity, to quote Teilhard de Chardin, in every rock, butterfly, leaf, lizard, and tree and buzzard. So I do commune with God in nature. And I just wanted, and I know both of you really find it important, and I just wanted to circle back to that to see if you wanted to say anything else, because we've been covering so much material here.
So I would like to talk about how wonderful it is to be outside, and to have the time to notice, the butterfly going from one flower to the other, or the hummingbird that comes in and zeroes in on, what they need for breakfast one day. And of course, I love trees, but I also like shrubs as well. And particularly those that turn bright red at this time of year. So I love to attend to seasonal changes. Those are my favorite times, those transitions. And to also attend to the stillness. That is one of my favorite aspects of being outside in nature, is that if you stop and there's no noise pollution from planes and cars and whatever, you can actually feel the stillness. And to me, there's nothing like stillness. There's nothing like it. And I have found, for example, the stillest place I've been is the Grand Canyon. The stillest morning of the week is Sunday morning, because people are out running around. The stillest morning of the year is Christmas morning. But there's just such wonderful stillness. I just like to bask in it, because I think it is that God energy that's what you're talking about, Ed, when you say that luminosity and God being there. It feels like this energy that holds everything together. So that's why I feel the need to try to go outside almost every day, just to bring and to breathe in some of that, all of that. that is part of the creation.
Lisa?
Oh, ditto, ditto. I mean, has there ever been a mystic that didn't write about trees? And if you're in the South, about oak trees, right? I mean, that's this is so universal. So I could talk for hours on that. It does remind us to advocate for our public spaces and to, one thing in this pandemic is I live close to Piedmont Park, and you can just see it. I think it's saved people's lives. And so in our advocacy work, to remember that our public spaces for nature for all people is going to be part of the work that we have in front of us after this week and forward.
What a great segue, Lisa, into my last kind of area of conversation with the two of you. We're just days away from what some people say is the most important presidential election in our history, certainly in modern times. We don't have to go to a partisan place in this conversation at all. I simply want to acknowledge that I feel a kind of escalation of stress in the environment. I'm not gonna not watch the news tonight. However, I do want to I want to practice self-focus. That news seems to have a higher quotient of stridency than last night's news and the night before that. So it's a double question I'm asking you all to comment on our practicing healthy spirituality and mental health here in the next 7 days or 6 days, whatever it is. When this airs, it will be the next 2 days. And then this business of kind of also, not instead of, but also living on the other side of the election. And what is the healthy spiritual and mental health commitment and heart posture about what our citizen leadership responsibilities are going to be then? Whatever comes to your mind with that. I know it's a jumbled question, with apologies for that. But what comes to your mind? What are you thinking and feeling?
I can jump in, and I'm really speaking more from my reflections and work on the rector search committee, but I think our political lives are going to be in one place, and that is unfolding. But our life as a church, I think, is really our call here. What are we called to do as a church? How do we meet this moment, not necessarily in a political way, but to speak, as we've said in this whole conversation, what does God want from us? What is our work to do in the world? And I think we all realize we have a whole lot of work to do. And part of what I see in the younger generation sometimes struggling is a lack of sometimes a groundedness to fall back on. And I think we as a church need to really embrace our tradition and go out and speak to that to meet the world where it is right now. That comes down to very basic things like, the commandments of telling the truth, the commandments of, again, loving ourselves, loving each other, to see the world from the viewpoint of those who suffer. So that's different than a political message. And so that's where my head and heart have been, just as what will we be called to do as a church? And I think the call is in front of us, and we have to do it in community.
So I'm thinking that, of course, I have encountered lots of people recently who feel very anxious They express it to me. They're like, why aren't you, why aren't you anxious about this? It's down to, and of course, for me, I've lived through many elections. This is not obviously the first. And I find history to be very cyclical in some ways. And so I have told people, I said, I think you need to watch your thoughts. Because people actually spend a lot of time ruminating on things. And I find, particularly with certain social media outlets or television networks, some seem to elicit more anxiety than others. It's almost as if they're like, okay, let's play the anxiety song here, so all of us could be anxious together. And so I, of course, as I said before, tend to resist that by not watching it. But I also attend to, what am I thinking about throughout the day? And are my thoughts upsetting me, or are they thoughts that are uplifting me? And I find particularly some people are not sleeping. And so I said, well, you might want to try a mantra. What's your favorite, biblical scripture? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Yea, though I may walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Whatever you need to say over and over again, so that your mind has not left with you, and that you sort of rein that back in, so that you can function without all of this fear and anxiety. Something's going to happen, we know that, one way or the other. And I think utilizing our spiritual resources will be able to maneuver that. The second thing, though, I think, which relates to, well, so what are we going to do afterwards, is it's a great time to ask that question. All right, we've been through all of this. What is God calling me to do? What am I being called to do for the next segment of this? Am I a person who is called to work on racial justice, or with refugees, or with immigration, or with climate? I mean, we have so many possibilities. And I think we each have a unique gift and ability and talent that we can put to work in whatever that is. And so again, I'm a very contemplative spiritual type, practical spiritual type, is to take that time and ask, where are you calling me? There are many possibilities. And so what is mine? And what is my work to do? And obviously some people will be able to do that in their churches, as Lisa mentioned, but there are a lot of unchurched people out there who, still want to feel like they are making a difference, or want to feel like they have some purpose to their lives. And so this is a great opportunity to, again, utilize that discernment and to get to work. Because I think we all can be contributing in some kind of way to the restoration of God's beloved creation. And there's lots of work to do, because there's lots of people who have been traumatized by the pandemic, by the political climate in whatever way you want to describe it. And so there's plenty of healing work to do. And we've got amazing amounts of talent out there who can attend to those needs. So I don't want people to be, hiding under the bed or the covers or whatever. It's like, now is the time. It's almost like we're gonna start a new chapter one way or the other. And so I think we need to be prepared to, for those next, that 2021, we need to prepare for whatever it is that God has for us to do in that new year.
Well, speaking of building a observation deck on my soul and what feeds it, having conversation with the two of you really has been very nourishing. And I'm deeply, deeply grateful to both of you for taking the time for this conversation. And I do want to underscore the fact that today, the day that this is being viewed, is All Saints Sunday, in which we celebrate community. And both of you have talked about how none of us can do this alone. We really do need one another. And I really appreciate the community the three of us have formed today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, Ed. It's just always a joy
Thank you.
to be with you and to be here for our community.
Yeah. And thank you all for viewing. Please understand that we are going to be continuing this kind of conversation, particularly through November, as we digest where are we and what is our call? What's our job versus what is our call to respond to this moment? So have a great All Saints Sunday afternoon. Bye-bye.
Right.